Hi, I'm Andrew, and this is Blaster Breakdown. If you've seen any of my gameplay footage, you may have noticed me using my red Super Prophecy. This is a remote line HPA blaster using Spectre's Super Core in the traditional semi-automatic configuration. Today, I'll show you how I turned that into the Super Duper Prophecy. This is now a fully automatic blaster, capable of 8 or 10 shots per second at velocities of 300 FPS and more. Now, while there are more advanced HPA blasters such as Spectre's CREM and Airzone's HPA FDL, the challenge I set myself was replicating automatic fire using cheap components that anyone can buy and implement without any knowledge of programming or needing to flash code at all. By the end of this video, I think you'll agree that I've accomplished my objective. This is going to be quite a long video, so I'll ask you to bear with me. I do go into quite a bit of detail about how the Super Core works, how manual and solenoid valves work, and how that feeds into the decisions that I made when putting this blaster together. Of course, if it's stuff you already know, just skip ahead to the next bit. I'll show you how I took down the semi-automatic build, the components I need to make it fully automatic, how I fit them into the blaster and then put it back together. I'll also talk about the testing I did to tune the settings for the blaster to get the output that I was looking for, talk about how I plan on using this blaster and what configuration suits me. And then of course we'll have a firing demo at the end. Let's have a look inside.
First of all, I thought I'd start with an explanation or refresher on how the Super Core works. That'll help explain some of the decisions that I make later on. If you already know all this, you just skip forward a few minutes. So the Super Core is a sealed metal cylinder that stores air at a pressure that you set with your regulator going in the back. When the core is pressurized, this pusher is extended through the power of that air, and that chambers a dart into the receiver. So with this version, these are made of brass. So the air comes in, pressurizes the core, pusher goes forward, and a dart is chambered like so. Then you have your barrel screwed on the end, and that's pressurized, full of air, that's extended, ready to fire the dart. At the back of the core, same as the Specs VZ, there's a quick exhaust diaphragm. When the pressure at the back begins to drop, that diaphragm flips position and opens up an inner stem that runs through and dumps air out the front. So the dart's chambered when the core is pressurized. The diaphragm flips position, air shoots out the front through the receiver where the dart is chambered. Dart goes through the barrel. When the core is then depressurized, a spring inside pushes the pusher back. So with no air pressure, the pusher naturally sits back because of that spring. Now, in a traditional, manual setup, we would have an MJVO3 valve. Air comes in here through the valve to pressurize the core. This is a normally open valve. So when our air supply is connected here, air flows all the way through and straight away pressurizes the core and chambers the dart. So with your air supply connected at rest, this is a closed bolt system where the pusher is always pressed forward into the receiver. Then when we pull the trigger, which is generally connected to this button here, that begins venting air through this hole, closing off the inlet at the same time. So the inlet is closed off, air begins venting through the back here, and that's what flips the diaphragm to dump the air forward. So that's the traditional, default, original, basic setup for a Super Core using a manual MJVO3 valve. Now, a variation on that is to replace the manual valve with a solenoid. So here's the solenoid that I'm going to use. So the difference between a solenoid and a manual valve is that instead of having a physical action to move between open and closed, a solenoid uses an electrical signal to flip states. So you can look up how solenoids work in your own time if you like, but essentially an electrical signal will flip from open to closed or closed to open. This one comes in a normally closed configuration by default. So when we connect our air to the inlet and the supercore to the outlet, nothing will happen because the airway through will be closed off until we apply an electrical signal. Now this one, you can actually open it up and flip a component around to swap it over to be a normally open. In that case, it will work in the same way as the manual valve, where air will pass all the way through and the pusher will be pressed forward at rest until an electrical signal is applied, and that will do the same thing as pressing the button. The core will fire upon receipt of that electrical signal. The bolt will stay open, i.e. pressed back in, as long as that signal is applied, and then, which is the same as holding the button down, holding the trigger down, and then at rest, the air will flow back through, the next dart will be chambered. So that's one way of using a solenoid in more or less the same way as the manual valve. As soon as the trigger is pulled, a dart is fired, the bolt is open while the trigger is held, and then upon release, the next dart is chambered. Like the manual MJV03 valve, it means to reload, to swap your mags out, you'll need to hold the trigger to keep the air closed off and the pusher back all the way. So what does a normally closed valve mean when using the supercore? Well, first of all, it means at rest, i.e. without having pulled the trigger, the bolt is going to be back all the way. That makes it easier for reloading because we don't need to hold the trigger to retract the bolt to get our magazine out and the next one in. So that's one benefit. The downside of that though is that the core will only be pressurized, chamber the next dart, while we hold the trigger down, an electrical signal is applied, and the dart won't be fired until we release the trigger. So technically, yes, that works, but it's going to feel a bit funky when you pull a trigger to load a dart and release the trigger to fire it. That's not what I'm after in this case. And the reason that feels funky is the delay in time between pulling the trigger and releasing it. Even if you can do that really quickly manually, it's still going to feel a bit weird. So what I want instead is an electrical signal that opens the solenoid valve quickly enough to pressurize the core and chamber a dart, only as long as it needs to reach the desired pressure, and then shuts off the solenoid back to its closed state to fire the dart without having to rely on a finger on a trigger pressing and releasing. So if you like, I need something to generate a pulse of electricity for a configurable period of time. And if I can do that for one pulse, why not do it for 4 pulses a second, 8 pulses a second, 10 pulses a second? And that's where this pulse generator comes in. The way this works is connect up your positive and negative from your battery, and this PWM output provides a pulse of electricity at a configurable frequency and a configurable duty cycle, that is the percentage of that frequency that the signal is on versus off. So I've wired this up to a LiPo and put a switch in series, and so this will simulate my trigger. So when I pull the trigger, you can see these are my current settings, and maybe you can hear the solenoid switching between open and closed or closed and open. So here's my output at the moment. 1 is the frequency, so 1 pulse per second, and I'm currently set to 5% of that time the signal is on, 95% of the time the signal is off. So 1000 milliseconds in a second, so 5% of that is 50 milliseconds. This valve is closed, swapping to open for 50 milliseconds, and then closed again for 950 milliseconds. And I can adjust this. Say if I make the proportion of the signal 50%, you can hear it going on, off, on, off, on, off. That's open, closed, open, closed, open, closed. Still 1 cycle per second, but 50%, that'll be 500 milliseconds. It's open, 500 milliseconds, it's closed. And I can also increase the frequency. So this is now going 5 cycles per second, on and off, 5 times per second. So each cycle will be 200 milliseconds. That's a fifth of 1 second. 50% of 200 milliseconds is 100 milliseconds for on, 100 milliseconds for off. So my challenge here is to find the length of time that I need to pressurize the core, that is, send an on signal to the solenoid, to let air through, to pressurize the core, chamber a dart, and then switch off so that the quick exhaust diaphragm flips position and the dart is fired in a short enough time period that it feels like the dart is being fired almost on trigger pull. That's my challenge. My second challenge is to work out the length of time that I need the valve closed so that the bolt retracts and the next dart can be chambered smoothly. If that period of time is too short, then the pusher may not get all the way back and I could have feeding issues. If the period is longer, then it just means my rate of fire is going to be a bit less than it could be otherwise. Okay, so the other thing I've done with the electronics is, because this signal output is not 12 volts to run the solenoid, that's going into MOSFET. So left hand is the signal, and then the middle goes to one end, and the right hand one goes to the battery. So that's your battery, that's your device, in this case the solenoid, and left hand is the signal. If you want to know how MOSFETs work, again, you can look that one up yourself. So, pulse generator, MOSFET, the switch, that will be our trigger. That's just a temporary connection to my LiPo, and the solenoid driving the supercore. Let's get some air and see if this works, hey? Okay, I might have described these ports incorrectly before. This one is actually the input that my air is connected to, and on this side, that's the output that the supercore is connected to. So everything else is connected fine. When I press this switch, we'll get power going to the pulse generator, and that'll send a signal out through the MOSFET for the solenoid to switch positions. What was it? 5 times a second? All right, let's see how we go. There you go. Pretty good. I'll just disconnect the air, and I'll just demonstrate some more about how that duty cycle goes. So we'll start with the 50%. So this is 1 cycle per second, and it's on and off 50% of the time each. As you can see, there's a long gap between the pusher going all the way forward and firing and releasing. So if I change that down to, let's say 10%, which is 100 milliseconds, still probably longer than I need, but we'll illustrate the point. So this will be on for 100 milliseconds and off for 900. And we'll see So you can see the period of time that the core is pressurized and the pusher is forward is much less than the period of time that it's back ready for the next dart to be loaded. We can even go further again, say we go down to 5%. So this will only be pressurized a 20th of the time per second. So you can see that's a really fast cycle now. We could even use this in a semi-auto configuration where even the lightest trigger pull is enough time to pressurize and chamber a dart and then fire in this case 50 milliseconds that we've set for each pulse. Cool. Now in my testing at about 90 psi, I've come up with a reasonable frequency of 8 shots per second. 10 was okay, but sometimes it have feeding problems. 8 shots per second was a good, reasonable, fast rate of fire that didn't seem to have any feeding issues. So that's what I'm going to be working on as my usual maximum rate of fire. But what I want to do is have the same 50 milliseconds to chamber a dart, which means I need to adjust the duty from 5% of 1,000 milliseconds to the equivalent percentage of 125 milliseconds, which is how long 8 cycles per second will be. So 50 milliseconds is 40% of 125. So I need to change my percentage from 5 up to 40%. So 8 shots per second is 125 milliseconds between shots, and 40% of 125 is 50 milliseconds that the signal is on and the core is pressurized, which will give me the same period of time to chamber a dart and the same response upon trigger pull. So last of all, same PSI, 8 shots per second, 50 milliseconds on, and see how it sounds. So as you can see, even at 8 shots per second, it's very easy to get single shots at a time. So that's how, in theory, it's going to work. I know the pneumatic components work. I know the electronic components work. I've got a good idea of the settings I'm going to use. What I need to do now is to fit everything into the Prophecy. So at the moment it's set up with MJVO3 valve connected to the trigger for a manual press, manual fire. I'm going to figure out how to fit the larger components of the solenoid plus pulse generator, MOSFET, and I'll use a smaller LiPo than this one, of course. It doesn't take a lot of power to run this solenoid. So yeah, but anyway, I'll need space for a LiPo of some kind inside the shell. So that's going to be the next challenge. I'll break open the red Prophecy and do a bit of reconfiguring. Okay, so here's my Super Prophecy as it's currently configured. So the main body of the blaster, we've got the super core in here, Talon adapter there. You can see the brass receiver in place there. The remote line connection comes through the base of the handle, and I've got that fixed in place with some epoxy putty because the base plate on the Prophecy is a bit different from the Retaliator, so I had to change that a little because I wanted the trigger to sit sort of further back. The MJVO3 valve is kind of around about here, and the outlet from that protrudes beyond this curve of the grip. Prophecy's got quite a narrow grip here, so there's a bit of hose sticking out there that I've covered up with tape and the grip, and that runs to the back of the Super Core, as we'll see soon. So this fixed stock is doesn't do anything. It's just there. I've got the Picatinny rail connected through there because where the Super Core sits, there's sort of nowhere between here and here to fix any of these screws. So I've got that going down through the stock attachment, but that's not real secure, and it actually has pulled out in the past. So I might try something different to attach that. Up the front, honey badger barrel, ergo foregrip. I've got a screw running through into the front of the main receiver to stop any sort of rotation when it's in use, and this sling point sort of just bridges that gap for a bit of additional stability. I don't carry it by that or anything. So currently I've got a 400mm barrel. This is just a cosmetic piece that covers a Blaster Tech scar that's adjustable. Well, why not show you what it looks like now? There you go. So I had this one printed in black just because, not really for public use, but so that's a Blaster Tech scar, top of a Monkey Mods barrel, and of course the whole point of the system is that you can screw it out of the receiver and swap over if you need to. So that much I can put aside. I'll pull the front off and the stock, and then we'll have a look at the inside next. Okay, so I quite like this ergonomic grip for the front of my blasters. I've used that on quite a few of mine. So that's just the Honey Badger barrel with the extra Picatinny rails on the side. One of the things I'm in the process of doing is converting all my blasters from using these Phillips head screws to using hex or socket cap screws. So I'll replace all these before this job is done. There's the stock. So this is that's been epoxied in. This is just one of the inserts, M3, to take the connection, to take a screw through the top of the Picatinny rail to hold it at the back. That actually came loose with a bit of use, so that's where I need a better solution. And this stock, you can see I had to cut quite a bit of space at the back and the inside here, and what that did was make room for this hose, this elbow piece, to fit to get into the back of the Super Core. So we'll see that a bit closer when we open up this part. So the cap, again, you can see I've cut away that space to slot over. This is just a rubber grip you can get from eBay or AliExpress. Just search rubber pistol grip or something like that. And then this tape is not structural, it's just sort of to pad out the thickness of the grip. All right, and here as you can see where the back, this elbow goes into the MJB03 valve, and I had to do that to avoid the button protruding into the to the trigger well. So it's not a terrible protrusion, but you can feel it, and that's why I went with the tape around to smooth some of those contours, and then the rubber grip over the top. Okay, so let's bust this apart now. Okay, I might just dump all those out because they're going to be replaced. So here you can see where I've cut the trigger down, and so that's where it, don't need you anymore, that's where it will activate the MJV03 valve. and so you can see the epoxy putty underneath on both sides. And I've used this 45-degree brass piece for a bit of additional support, so that when it's held together, it's a really firm, solid connection to the airline. Nothing's wiggling loose at all. But you can see I've also removed the mag release lever, because that's not needed. I've just painted the bottom of that one. So otherwise the supercore, the pneumatic assembly is quite standard. You can see where holes have been made to fit the line in through the series of elbows. Okay, now when I grab the solenoid, this is not going to fit in the grip. Not at all. So that's going to sit at the back here. Somehow I'll use a smaller attachment than that. The trigger will be somewhere here. So actually that feels pretty good. Yep, alright, so that'll be somewhere like that. The wires going to the back. Obviously the wires themselves will be trimmed, and then a battery, something like that. The airline, one hose will go directly into the back of the supercore, and the second one is going to have to go to the inlet. If I use the grip as the way in, which is my inclination, then I'll just run it like so, and then do a right angle down the bottom here. Alright, but as you can see, all that's not going to fit inside this part of the stock. So I need another stock solution. But yes, I think that's going to work nicely. Yep, that's going to fit everything in quite well. So this is a worker stock, solid plastic, so the standard attachment will fit in, and it's got this rubber end cap, and so I should be able to fit everything I need in here, but also have access to this so that I can adjust my rate of fire and cycle, and then just tuck it back inside if I need to switch between whatever my settings are for a given match. Yeah, okay, that's going to work well. So I need to make enough space in here to get the airline in and then out to the core. Space for these wires to go through the back. Work out the right way of being able to attach and detach each of them, especially the airlines. And then I think I can just shove everything in and put it back together. Alright, so first thing's going to be this elbow at the back of the supercore. I'll make that to like just a straight push fit, because that's all it needs to be, straight. Yeah, and I'll see about how I'm going to attach everything else. I'll replace that with a slimmer one like this Legree fitting. Alright, I don't think there's going to be too much to this. So let me get some work done and we'll check back in. Okay, so I've got quite a bit of work done now, which is good. First of all, the switch from the trigger. I've removed the little metal lever, so it's just a press button there. I cut a little bit of space here and on the left side of the shell to fit this this switch, and so now it sits just about there, and so There's very little travel on the trigger pull, which is good. Nice hair trigger. I've stuck a couple of screws through. I'm going to put some epoxy putty on both sides, and that'll just sort of wedge it in place to hold it nice and securely. Now I've got these connectors that will run through the stock so that I can take the stock apart for servicing. And so the same with the Super Core and the remote line connection. So I'll sit somewhere like that, and then to the solenoid, which will be sitting back here. These hoses go in. There'll be a bit of slack, so that I'll fix them in place, but then when I attach the stock, it'll move back a couple of centimeters, but that's okay. I've got enough space in there. So 2 hoses to go into the air inlet and the Super Core, and connection from the switch will join up the battery positive with the pulse generator. Pulse generator negative going to the negative side. The solenoid also has a positive joining in to positive there, and the other side, the negative, goes through the MOSFET, which I've just wrapped up in some heat shrink, and the signal for that, of course, is the output from the pulse generator. So it's all the same components I had previously, but shortened, simplified a little. So now if I connect my trigger switch, and I've got this little LiPo, and plug that in, we should hear very nice. Okay, so that's the cabling and electrical work I've done. With the stock itself, so it's glued together, so it doesn't come apart like so. What I needed to do, you can see there's posts, well, glue posts, I guess they are, not screw posts. And there was another one here. And so I ground that one away, cut that one down, just so that I could fit in the solenoid. The push fits were a bit too wide to fit through. The opening was sort of only about that much. So I've made a bit of extra space there. It doesn't affect the structural integrity of this at all. The other thing is this one, if you can see, there's a spring rest that runs inside, like lots of the worker stocks, to hold a longer spring. So that would go to about there. And there's a screw in the bottom there, and so I removed the screw and drilled out with a 1/2 inch drill bit. So that's 12.7 millimeters, which should nicely fit 2 6mm hoses and a cable with enough space, yet firmly so it's not going to jump around a lot. The only other thing I think I need to do here is where this connects, we'll have the connection for the remote line like so. So I need to cut away the inside of here so that the hose can come down, go below this stock attachment point, and run sort of right along here, which is fine. I've done that in plenty of other stocks. So I think that's the last thing I need to do with the stock. Make space in here for the hose, the inlet hose, to come through and go down low enough to plug in here. Then epoxy putty for the switch in place there. Then I can do a final check, measure and cut for my hoses, and then we're just about ready to shove everything inside. So we'll check in again in a little bit. Okay, so I've made a bit more progress. Here's the switch on a bed of epoxy putty. that's held in place there. I've also ground a bit of space here for the wires to go through, so now that'll sit nicely with the super core just like that. Trigger then sits here and that's nice and secure. Right, with the stock, here's where I cut out space for the hose, so that can sort of fit down like so. This piece used to be one joined in the middle, and it would fit, and the springs would fit in here, and then these would sit on the edge like so, and that's the bit that would slot into the stock cap. So that's now in two pieces so that there's nothing in between, and this one had a little knob there that I've cut short, but I can now put this back together, and these are still spring loaded. They will have a tendency to slide outwards, but you know, you can still get it on and off and it will hold the stock firmly enough, just like that. So that's just got 4 little screws to hold it in place. Okay, so otherwise that's pretty much ready to go. Okay, so another thing I've done is I've got this new end cap and I've cut away a slot in the bottom, and I've cut away this bit here. So the idea is that this right angle piece will be like that, and so this will be the air inlet coming in, and that'll go through into the back. But first, that'll have a bit of flexibility to go like so. There'll be another hose going into the super core, and this will slot over the top, held in place with 2 screws in the normal way. Just poke that out of the way for now. So that'll go through like so, and then these 2 are in place. Okay, so you can't see anything, but the hose, can't see anything there either. Anyway, so the hose will fit all the way through, up through that channel. And of course the switch will be connected, and there'll be another hose for the air to the super core. So I think I can have a go at putting this together now. Okay, I've done a bit more testing, and this is my final arrangement. So did a bit more work making space at the back of the stock here. There was another glue post, I guess, across here, so I've cut that out. So now this whole back section is free for me to fit in my components. That's good. So the solenoid is already in there. So I've got the 2 hoses, 2 lines. One is the air coming in, that's the longer one. I've cut these to length. The shorter one is going to the super core, and then the JST connector goes to our switch up the front there. One thing I want to do before I put this together, I wasn't happy with the previous way that I had the Picatinny rail on the top connected. It was a bit loose, it came loose, it wasn't solid enough. So what I've done is measured and cut a little hole, and then what I want to do is attach this rail with a little squared nut directly, so that's in place first. So I'm going to do that before I connect everything together, so I've got a solid connection for my Picatinny rail. we'll see how solid that is. Okay, now I can connect up my wires. Now I don't want too much loose wire inside this section here, so I want to actually pull it back that way as far as I can, but because I don't want this to be pulled loose, I'm going to put a bit of electrical tape around that connection just to hold it. And then I want to gently sort of out of the way as much as possible. Now, although I've cut these to length, they're long enough to fit everything in place when the stock is sitting about there. When I then move the stock forward, everything is going to move back by 3 or 4 centimeters. So that's all right, because I've got enough space at the back there. All right, so then I can connect my air lines, the air in, we've got the super core, actually pliers helps to grip this. All right, that's in all the way. So that's like that, and that's like that. Just make sure the cable comes back a little bit more. It'd be tempting to put it all together now, but prudent to test. So I'll just make sure that, as you can see, that's still going. So that's good. Okay, so then this half of the shell, I can make sure that's in place good. So I can slip this over. Good. All right, do these up. Right, then the stock attachment point, I've cut the bottom, so it's got a little snap there. So I just want to slip that over. Aha! Right, that's snapped in place, that's good. Okay, so it's good. Now you can slide this forward. That'll push the solenoid back just a touch. And that's in. And that's in. That's good. And our last Picatinny attachment up here. Yeah, that's nice and solid. So held in with a screw there, held in with a screw there. That's good. The stock is on nice and solid. You can see the solenoid, the back is just visible there. So final check trigger. That's firing, that's good. Let's test the air. That's good, I can't hear any leak there. So we set to 100. Nice. Right, that's working, so we can just battery, MOSFET, wires, pulse generator in very carefully. Yes. Okay, sorry about that. My camera battery just died right at the end there. So the last thing I was going to show you was that I'd replaced the Honey Badger front handguard, as you could see in the video. So I've replaced the screws, well, they're actually bolts, with socket or hex countersunk bolts in this case. So that's all nice and consistent. The barrel I had in place when I was reassembling was one of Spectre's hybrid barrels with 30 centimeters of 17/32 brass inside. I've actually gone back to the 40 centimeter Monkey Mods barrel, and I've got this is a Spectre anodized aluminium scar, 6-thread quarter twist, and I've scraped off the orange anodizing and painted it shiny red to match everything else. Final thing I've done is I got some of this big fat heat shrink to cover up the pulse generator. 25 centimeter diameter is the size. That covers this nicely, so that's just a bit of additional protection. It's clear, so I can still read the settings, and I can access the buttons, so I can make any adjustments I need. So that's everything I had to put this together. So when I'm firing, obviously battery gets connected. I'm not doing that right now for storage. Bit of cable management. Otherwise that all fits in nicely like so. And that is my completed blaster. Okay, so originally I was going to show you how I went through and tuned the settings, but that worked out to be pretty boring to watch, so instead I'll just tell you what I've done. Okay, so the two timings that we need to think about and test to configure, and this will vary blaster to blaster based on your setup, the fittings you're using, the length of hose, remote line versus bottle on, and so on. So we've got the on pulse, which opens air to the solenoid, pressurizes the system, and we've got the off pulse, which cuts off air and lets the system reset back to open bolt. So the on time needs to be long enough to pressurize the core, extend the pusher, chamber the dart, and reach the desired internal pressure to then generate the FPS we want when the dart's fired. And I'm aiming between 250 to 300. 300 is a cap for the Brisbane area Nerf Group's high FPS events. So if I can get something around 270, 280 on a consistent basis, that's really good. Now, if that time period is too short, the core may not reach the full input pressure, and so FPS would drop. Or if it's much too short, you may not even get the pusher extended all the way forward to chamber the dart and not get a seal in the breech. If that time is too long, then we don't get any additional benefit, any more FPS at that PSI. It just will be a longer delay between pulling the trigger, which opens the valve, and the dart actually firing. So that time period, we want to be long enough to pressurize the core to give us the FPS that we want, but as short as possible to give us the best trigger response. That is the time between pulling the trigger and a dart actually firing. The second time period that we're concerned with is the off pulse, the length of the off pulse, where the solenoid is closed and air is cut off from the blaster. That's when the spring will cause the pusher to retract back inside the supercore, and that lets the next dart advance up to the top of the magazine. Now, that time period can be as long as you like. You could have a minute or you could have an hour. That's not going to affect how the next dart fires, but the longer that time period is, then the slower the rate of fire is going to be if we want automatic fire. However, if that time period is too short and we don't allow enough time for the bolt to retract fully and allow the next dart to advance, we could have feeding issues if the next dart isn't fully aligned with the receiver when the next on pulse occurs. So with the off pulse, we want to find the smallest period of time that it takes for the pusher to retract to allow clean and regular and reliable feeding. Now, that doesn't depend on the PSI. Once the solenoid is closed off with the off pulse, there's no air in the system, the dart's been fired, the pusher retracts at the same rate, regardless of whatever our input PSI had been. And I found that best results were about with 75 milliseconds off time. It would be okay some of the times with shorter off periods, allowing a high rate of fire, but that increased the risk of jams or misfires, or the pusher advancing before the next dart had got to the top of the magazine, and so there was nothing to fire. So 70 to 75 is what I came up with for this system. That was a reliable loading and reliable feeding delay, while giving me the reliability that I know pretty much all the darts are going to fire as I expect. Then it came down to thinking about what PSI I wanted to use, 80, 100, 120, something more, something less. In the end, I settled on 100 PSI. As mentioned, 80 PSI required a longer time period, say 75 milliseconds, for the solenoid to be open, to pressurize and get ready to fire a dart. And I would prefer a less time. I'd prefer a shorter time between the trigger pull and firing the dart. I like the feeling of 50 milliseconds at 100 PSI. With 120 PSI, 40 milliseconds was a bit better again. However, I did find at 120 PSI, I would get jams more often, and that may have been the speed of the pusher being a bit too fast to get the darts to feed in neatly, but I did find that jams were a bit more common at the high PSI. So for the sake of reliability, 100 PSI is what I've settled on using, at least initially. So 50 milliseconds for my on pulse is what I'll use. And as I mentioned, the off pulse to retract the pusher, get the next dart ready to load, 75 milliseconds works out quite neatly. So 50 and 75 is 125 milliseconds per on-off cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, that was sort of my beginning guesstimate when I was testing initially, and that's actually worked out quite nicely to be a reliable 8 darts a second, 125 milliseconds total cycle, 50 milliseconds on, 75 milliseconds off. So that's what I'm going to be using when I first take this blaster to war. 100 PSI input, 8 darts per second. So then the duty cycle becomes 40% on, 60% off. So 125 milliseconds, 40% of that is 50, 60% of that is 75, and that's my timings. So that's the principles that I had in mind when tuning my pulse generator settings and regulator input for this blaster.
As I say, depending on how yours might be set up, whether remote line or bottle on, the length of your hose in between, you may have different settings for your on versus off time. Your desired rate of fire might be higher or lower. You might have better results at higher PSI, for example, than me, and get even higher than 8 darts per second on a regular, reliable basis. So I'm really interested to see how other people go using this sort of setup, and to see what sort of results others in the community get. Okay, so a couple of other things to consider were, I wanted to see if my regulator would sustain the airflow needed for 8 darts a second at 100 psi. So I've been using these little 13 cubic inch bottles, 3000 psi lately. I find one of these is good for a round at a time, and I've got several of these, so I just swap over in between rounds in our games. And I've got a Polar MRS regulator. This is one with the degas knob, so I can change my bottles even if they're not completely empty without trouble. So set at 100 psi, I wanted to see if this could stand up to the air supply required, and happily I found there was absolutely no trouble, even when it was going up to 10 darts per second at 100 psi. No trouble at all, this regulator keeping up, which is fantastic to see. So, rate of fire is fine in terms of air supply. The next thing was capacity. And so my question was, how much air does it take to fire 1 magazine, 3, 5 magazines? How many darts can I fire at 100 psi out of one of these little bottles? And again, happily, I found that the air pressure didn't start dropping off until I'd fired at least 120, 130 darts at 100 psi. My typical loadout is 5 20 dart magazines, 4 in my chest, 1 in the blaster, which sees me through pretty much any of the game types that we play at our events. So for my purposes, one of these bottles lasts me easily 1 round, 1 full loadout, which is great. So in between rounds, when I'm reloading my darts, all I do is swap the bottle over, and I'm happy, and that's great. Alright, so the last thing is a firing demo, so I'm going to load up some magazines with the darts, and we'll see what it looks like pulling the trigger.
Okay, so here we are, 50 feet from the target. I've got my little bottle in my pocket, 13 cubic inch, 3000 psi. My reg is set at 100 psi in, and 8 shots per second. 3 types of darts I'm going to use today: ACCs, some white Worker Gen 3s, and then Nexus Pro darts. So for each type I'm going to do a few single shots, a few burst, and then empty the mag, starting off with ACCs. Gen 3s next. Nexus Pro. And last of all, just some mag dumps. There's a jam. And Pro darts last of all. That's it. Okay, so I can see from that the ACC darts were not accurate at all. Maybe the scar, maybe a slightly smaller diameter, meant they weren't getting the right rate of twist. The Gen 3s went really well, and the Nexus Pro darts went really well. A couple of jams, one of the Gen 3s got stuck. Maybe it was a poor quality dart, but as you saw, that cleared really quickly, really easily. So 5 full magazines, 100 darts is a typical loadout that lasts 10-15 minutes. Our games usually go. My bottle is below 1000 psi, getting close to 0. In fact, if I just pull the trigger, we'll see how much air is left. and now it's dropping down. So that would be another mag's worth, another 20 or 30 darts at full FPS before it begins dropping off. So that's enough to last me one full round. I've got spare bottles, so the plan is I'll just switch over in between rounds with full capacity each time. So there you have it. That's the Super Duper Prophecy. Now a fully automatic remote line HPA blaster capable of 8 to 10 shots per second at 300 FPS and beyond. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.